Welcome to America's Public Forum, the Braver Angels DC Project's flagship series of events in the nation's capital, exploring questions of division and unity, ideology and identity, faith and faction, and the philosophical implications of depolarization work, with help from the most thoughtful analysts and activists across the field. Across the country, our citizen leaders believe and practice an ethos of unconditional goodwill across all divides, cultural, social, and political, to help Americans from every walk of life find value in each other no matter what. Here in DC, where the stakes of power are high and the questions of meaning are historic, we do exactly the same thing with friends in scholarship, journalism, activism, advocacy, and public service in every nook across the ideological spectrum, for we cannot expect a more thoughtful public discourse unless we practice it ourselves. We only ask hard questions and we don't always come to firm conclusions. Our goal is only ever to think a little clearer about the problems of nationhood in 1,000 different ways, and that is why we're here tonight. So let's give some special thanks to our friends at American Purpose and our hosts here at the Hamilton for helping us to deliver this event. My name is Luke Nathan Phillips, and I direct the Braver Angels DC Project. Tonight, we are joined by Michael Mazarr of the RAND Corporation and Seth Kaplan of Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. Kaplan and Mazarr are scholars of international relations with decades worth of experience studying social breakdown in developing countries, elite decision-making in crisis situations, international development, defense policy, and a slew of related questions. And they have advised clients in the US government and the development community on these, among other things. Each of them has recently written a book on questions of social trust, social cohesion, and national resilience from their distinct disciplines. Kaplan's is called Fragile Neighborhoods, Repairing American Society One Zip Code at a Time, and it will be published this October, and you can find a card with details on it on the table in the back. We'll pass those out soon. Mazarr's is The Societal Foundations of National Competitiveness, published by the RAND Corporation and available on their website and by request, if I understand that right. So tonight, there's a couple things we'll be talking about. How does depolarization, bridge building, trust building, and bipartisan work look when we consider it as an element of national strategy? Is social trust a security issue? And are domestic divides inescapably wrapped up in security concerns? What can depol activists learn from peace building and social trust in developing states and from national strategic planners who wargame domestic security concerns? For these questions and more, I am happy and pleased to be joined by Seth and Mike here tonight. So let's send that first question off to you, Seth. Everything I just said opens up a bunch of things for you to mull on. And also, just tell us about your book. Tell us about why you wrote it and what your general argument of it is.
So first, thank you so much for making an effort to do this, Luke. And I do want to thank everyone for coming, and of course, Braver Angels, an important organization that we only wish was doing more and was larger and had a bigger impact on our country. So we really appreciate all the work and all the volunteers. So if there was one lesson I would learn from my work in lots of countries, people mostly know me in Washington for work on fragile states, political transitions, preventing violent conflict. The one lesson that I take away from wherever I go is that relationships matter, and the stronger the relationships in a society, the more likely the country will have no violence, will have strong economic gains, and will have a positive trajectory. So when people, my book, when people ask me 2015, 2016, is America a fragile state? And I got that question a lot, and you can guess why, given what was happening in our politics. I didn't take the question very seriously at first, because this is not Nigeria, this is not Somalia, this is not Syria. It's a very, very different context. But I spent some years going around lots of places, lots of people, lots of books, and my conclusion is not a fragile state, but a very fragile society. And the fragility, again, is relationships, but it's not the relationships at the high level, it's the thinning of our relationships on a personal level. If you look at all the ills of our society. We're here because we worry about polarization. We worry about growing distrust or mistrust in our society. But look at other problems we have. We have over 100,000 people dying from drug overdoses. That's almost twice what happened in Vietnam over almost 20 years. You have rising depression, rising mental illness. I can go on and talk about the violence in our streets. We can talk about the alienation and anger among parts of our population on all sides of the spectrum. I would argue many of these problems are due to what has happened in our relationships and what has happened in the institutions that shape our relationships, and therefore they're downstream from what goes on in our neighborhoods. That's why my book is called Fragile Neighborhoods, because I don't think you can deal with everything from inequality to the problems of deaths of despair to polarization unless we are a country, a flourishing country built on flourishing neighborhoods where every person lives in a place. Just think of your neighborhood. Is your neighborhood flourishing? Do you have lots of friends, relationships, institutions? If everyone had a neighborhood that was flourishing, they would be building relationships, they'd be building trust, they'd be working with people across political divides, class divides. Their lives would be better, and the whole country would have many fewer problems, including much less polarization.
Now, before we go to Mike, Seth, I want to press just very deeply on your earlier work as well. So fragile neighborhoods and fragile states are two different sorts of things, but what would you consider to be the way the international development community approaches fragile states and tries to do neighborhood level, individual level, community level trust building work in developing countries around the world, and how much do you think that is useful for informing the work on fragile neighborhoods domestically in America? Or is it even useful for that, or is it an entirely different ballpark?
I mean, for me, there's amazing number of parallels. Clearly, I work in Nigeria. I'm almost daily doing something in Nigeria. I'm also working on Libya. Those are my two most important countries, also more and more Ukraine. And so clearly the problems are not the same, but the parallels are amazing. And I would say the most obvious parallel is that we approach these problems with a technical mindset. We look at the material aspect and we try to basically remove problems. We look at everything as problems. We have a technical mindset and we try to fix the problems with basically either giving more of something or trying to analyze it. And we very rarely incorporate the relational aspect, the social aspect. We call them social problems, but how often have we thought about the social aspect of the social problems? And I would say when I work in many countries, clearly, I mean, you could think of some examples where people really thought relationally, but I work on Libya, and the government, the UN actually leads the political process, or the attempt to have a political process. It's incredibly technical. It's incredibly one way of doing it fits every case. Libya is a very different country with very different problems, yet they're bringing the same tools they bring from here to there. So for me, this idea that we need a technical mindset, we need to focus on the material aspect of problems, completely misses the boat. We need to go back to think of what are the building blocks, and this is something that you can find in Michael's work, because I have read his work when it first came out, that there is part of what he talks about in terms of social aspects. And if you want a strong society, you need to have something about cohesion, you need to have something about the dynamics. I brought it down locally because I think that's the heart of the problem in America. But it's still, the fact is we don't look at these problems relationally, we look at them technically. And even when we talk about polarization, it's always solutions. These problems don't have solutions unless you have these strong building blocks, which are strong institutions, strong blocks of relationships, strong neighborhoods, and all the things that people need to live in or live with to be flourishing.
Thank you, Seth. We will pile in a little bit deeper onto some of these pretty shortly here. But Mike, Same question to you. How should we think about social trust as an element of national strategy? To what degree can there be information flowing both ways? And also tell us about your book, The Societal Foundations of National Competitiveness.
Thanks, Will. It's great to be here. Look forward to the conversation with all of you. This was a project that was funded by the Defense Department, actually, even though the questions that it asked are very broad and sort of social and integrative. It was asked by the Office of Net Assessment, which is kind of an internal think tank in DoD. And it stemmed from the idea that in foreign policy, national security these days, we're talking about great power rivalries, right? Particularly with China, also with Russia. That is the centerpiece of our focus. And historically and traditionally, a typical insight or claim that's made about those is the key to thriving in one of those rivalries is domestic strength. And just about all the last, probably 10, but the last 4 or 5 presidents in particular have all said some variant of we have to make America strong in order to be strong abroad, right? So, but our question was, that's a nice phrase, what does it actually mean? What are the qualities or characteristics of countries that tend to do well in these kinds of long-term international rivalries? So we were asking a little bit of a broader question, more from the top down a bit, but with a lot of the similar themes. And so we looked at a whole bunch of historical literatures. There's a fascinating literature, for example, on what's called the Great Divergence, which is after 1500, Europe kind of races ahead of the rest of the world at its development level, industrialization, all that. All bitter academic debates about the reasons for that. We did a bunch of individual case studies, ranging from ancient Rome all the way up to present-day United States, asking why a great power succeeded or failed at different times. And we eventually identified 7 characteristics that were common to countries that were competitively vibrant. And by that, we don't mean, great powers that crush their rival in the competition. We mean societies that generated energy, dynamism, economic growth, political legitimacy, and the kind of social relationships I think that Seth's talking about. And so just really quickly, the characteristics were national willpower. So that can go off the rails, but some sense of national mission and having a notion that your nation is trying to achieve something important in the world. This can be the Apollo program. This can be international aid. It's not talking about, colonialism. A unified national identity, pretty straightforward. Shared opportunity. So do you provide opportunity to the broadest number of people in society to get their talents, add to economic growth and development and innovation? Something we call an active state. So it's not a sort of saying that, in the political debates about state intervention, not making a judgment about that, but just appropriate to the time period, successful societies have always had a governing apparatus that intervened in ways to promote national competitiveness. Even in ancient Rome, the state was building roads, it was maintaining a military, it was doing basic tax policy, all the way up to modern day United States, and the famous examples post-war of investment in the national transportation infrastructure, things like DARPA that made it R&D investments that came over to the civilian side. So all kinds of ways that the state is a catalyst of national dynamism. The 5th one is effective institutions. So this is a really well-established principle in economics and political science that all of your institutions in society, your banks, your financial institutions, the rule of law, other kinds of things have to work effectively. The 6th one was what we called a learning and adapting mindset. So that's hard to measure, but kind of easy to see when you see it, or easy to recognize when you see it. That is a general societal sense of intellectual energy and discovery, and not being held back by sort of orthodoxy and limits on new thinking. And then finally, diversity and pluralism. So those 7 characteristics, you can find them in their own way, even in ancient Rome. You can find them in Meiji Japan during its period of rise. You can find them in Great Britain in the first industrial revolution, certainly in the United States. And so then in the last chapter we said, okay, how's the United States doing relative to these standards? And you can guess that there's sources of concern for a lot of them. And I won't go to the details, I'm sure we'll talk about those in the Q&A. The one thing I would say, sort of connecting to Seth's book and themes was, to me, this idea of a learning and adapting habit and mindset in a society is tremendously important. And when you have bureaucratic administrative ossification that kind of grinds down the wheels of society, when you have a marketplace of ideas that is increasingly corrupted by misinformation and disinformation, and when you have political polarization, that means that in particular your legislatures are incapable of doing decisive things, you have a social context that is not going to be able to compete very well with others. And in a lot of ways, as we know, that's kind of in part where we are today. And I would just end with a slightly more hopeful note. And in relation to your other question, the issue of trust is central to a number of these kind of themes, and we talk about it particularly in terms of unified national identity and things like that. The more hopeful conclusion is, in the post-war period, in our view, looking at a variety of kind of measurable indicators, the United States represented the most powerful example of all of these elements of these 7 forces working together in a positive synergy ever in human history. So we have this foundation of expanding shared opportunity and at times a very unified and powerful national identity, a sense of national exceptionalism, effective institutions, all of this stuff. A lot of it is still there, somewhat dormant, but the opportunity to tap back into that and again realize the promise of that American system is absolutely there. And so that ultimately makes me hopeful about the possibilities of recapturing some of the more positive kind of energies of these factors that the United States saw, in kind of the post-war heyday.
Mike, I found it interesting that unified national identity and diversity and pluralism are 2 of the marks of national strength that you mentioned here.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering to what degree you find those 2 things to be in tension with each other, or to be complementary to each other, or to what degree there's a general ability for those things to work with each other, or to what degree you can have some level of one and some level of the other and not more. I'm wondering how you mull on that.
No, absolutely right. I mean, they are definitely in tension. It's reflective of a larger theme that applies actually to all the characteristics. And one of the lessons, so in addition to identifying those 7 things, we came up with a lot of other kind of specific lessons and insights, and we're investigating some of those in a second phase now. But one of the big themes was balance. So in each of these areas, it's not that the most successful nations had the most of any one. It's that they had a productive and effective balance. So national ambition and will is a great example. That can, like I say, get out of control. It can lead to imperialism. It can lead to overreach. It can lead to a lot of negative things. But a complete absence of it means that national political leaders don't have the basis to rally popular commitment to kind of big dreams and big goals if they don't have a sense of national mission. So this balance is needed, and that's true of those 2 characteristics among others. So, and of course it evolves over time. Rome's balance is not what we would accept in a modern nation, but say again, in the post-war United States, you get this kind of expanding appreciation for diversity, strong political pluralism, sort of bounded and moderated by a strong, unifying force of solidarity under a national identity, and you get that balance, and those tensions kind of work. And a big problem, and you see this in a lot of historical examples, is when you get social trends that knock a country out of balance on one or more of these things, and then you get a lot of instability and problems.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think of all the things on the agenda for tonight, perhaps one of the ones that we can return to a couple times later in this conversation and possibly in the Q&A will be the question of what does an effective balance between national identity and diversity and pluralism look like for the highest possible levels of social trust. I think that would be a fascinating thing to discuss. So we'll get to that soon. But in the meantime, Now that we know what your books are about, still buy them though. Still, it's way more.
You don't even have to buy the Rand when you download it for free.
And they'll come after us for that. Great. Well, go read the books. But one of the ways to, I think, pull out some of the implications of this is, what does an America with not only the low levels that you're seeing now on your 7 indicators, Mike, and everything that you study, Seth, what does an America with lower levels of social trust and lower levels of the indicators of national competitiveness look like? I mean, to what degree was the long year 2020 something that is a harbinger of the future of longer sorts of shocks like this, or to what degree was that an aberration? I'm wondering why we should be concerned specifically about questions of social trust as a stability issue. I think some of that might be conceptually clear, but I'm wondering if you guys have specific thoughts on how that's played out in the past and what that would look like in the future.
I'm happy to talk about it. So it's a little bit closer to my work and not so close to the book. But I think the key point is, you worry about countries when polarization takes on some sort of form of identity. That would mean diminishing social cohesion. And if you could combine that diminishing social cohesion and this factionalism or tribalism around identity, if you have that and you combine it with institutions which are unable or diminishingly able to uphold equitable or fair, I mean, obviously it's an eye of the beholder, but to the more that institutions can be captured by one of the factions, whether economically, politically, whatever we mean by capture, to the extent that these institutions become biased in how they operate, and you have a society that is very factionalized or tribalized, that combination becomes very dangerous. That's basically what I deal with in fragile states. So we have more on, we certainly have a degree of tribalism. It's nothing like what I see in many of the countries I work in. I know for Americans, it's much worse than a couple of decades ago. It still has quite a ways to go before it would be Syria, for example. Syria is, and in many of these countries, it's not just two groups, it's multi-dimensional, and there's all these external parties intervening. And so, but our institutions so far have been very able to withstand the pressure, and I think the design of our Constitution gives me confidence, because the Constitution was designed to have bad actors have certain positions of power, and power is distributed, and there's checks and balances. So I would say, on the whole, I worry about these things, but I don't worry too much because of the nature of our system, the nature of our institutions, and because from my global perspective, we're not nearly as fractured or divided as many other places are. Why I write the book is because I most fear that this alienation on a personal level makes more and more people, I would say, desperate, or more and more people likely to be hijacked by more extremist views. And to the extent that people are not embedded in institutions and have vested interest in specific places, or vested interest in family, or vested interest in some part of society that they feel they belong to and they can contribute to, and that contributes to the whole, to the extent that those people or that group of people grows more and more, that to me is the greatest threat, because then the broader dynamic of polarization will likely be worse, and the risk that some institutions will become biased, I think, will become greater. So that's why I zero in on that problem and not the bigger problem that most people focus on.
You're bringing up biased institutions and extremist views, and
I would say fragmented society with extremism pulling them further apart, combined with biased institutions or captured institutions.
I'm wondering to what degree the extremist views part of this and individuals with extremist views is something that is a problem in and of itself, or if it's a problem that's mostly exacerbated by the social conditions and lack of
Yes,
trust and
yes.
stuff.
So there's plenty of data, or I would say plenty, but there's a fair amount of data that if you look at who votes for populist leaders, this is not only the United States, I mean, there's data from 2015, 2016, the Republican primaries, but there's also data in other countries, and there's a very good book about the rise of authoritarianism in the 30s and 40s, written by Eric Fromm, who talks about some of these problems. I mean, the main argument among these scholars is that people who are disconnected from relationships, that are isolated, that become alienated from their surroundings, they're much more likely to support extremist leaders, because that is a way to get connection, that is a way to find a home. The messages reach those people better, those people are more eager to support those people. And so I don't think you can, I mean, my main argument in my work around the world and on the United States is you cannot look at politics in isolation from what is going on in society. The term we would use is pre-political. That means before you look at politics, let's look at what is happening in the society. So for me, the social dynamics informs the political dynamics. And for me, the main criticism I have of all the people who worry about our polarization. There's a lot of people who write books about our polarization, a lot of people who write books about what's wrong with our democracy. They tend to focus only up here as if they've never spent time in different parts of the country. They've never been to Eastern Kentucky. They've never been to some of the neighborhoods in Detroit. They've never been down in Shreveport or wherever else you want to travel in this country. Those are all places I visited to learn. And they are writing as if they are in Washington and they're looking at the outcomes of what is going on in our society. They're not thinking about what are the inputs in terms of what are the people dealing with and how is that affecting the choices that they are making. And from my experience around the world, you can never, when you go to a country, and I hope everyone has a chance to travel and see parts of the world, do not stay in your hotel, do not read what's in the newspaper and be satisfied with it. You have to get out and you have to always be amongst the people and feel what the people are feeling and understand what the people are understanding and try to put yourself in their shoes and understand why they're doing something. I try really hard to be empathetic and try not to be judgmental. So my conclusion from my journeys to many parts of America was exactly what I see in many countries. The people who are alienated from whatever the politics or the larger dynamic and alienated from some groups and alienated from their neighbors, those are the people who are most likely to take those extremist views.
Mike, Seth says that we have at least a couple decades before we're Syria. And I'm wondering what your assessment is on that same front, and also what your assessment is on what the decline of all your factors looks like in an American context.
Well, so I totally agree that we're not on the brink of, I mean, that's, Syria's complete fragmentation of a society. I guess, I agree with what Seth's saying about the nature of what's going on in society. I think in answer to your earlier question, we've got a lot of literature on the importance of trust and what it means. And one of the traditional comparisons, Seth knows very well, in some of the literature is between what people will describe as high trust and low trust societies. And low trust societies are, by that they mean trust that spans across society. And so to what extent do you naturally assume that the small business owner or the auto repair person or the banker or whatever that you encounter is essentially trustworthy? In the United States, most European countries, classic examples of high trust societies where for the most part we go around kind of assuming that's the case. And then lower trust societies are those where the span of trust is more limited to the family typically. And so outside the family, or in some societies, the tribe, right, it's just kind of a different world. And so one question for the United States is, and there's a lot of evidence connecting that to all kinds of outcomes like economic outcomes. higher trust societies get, as you would imagine, enormous advantages. If you're a business person, you want to go make alliances or you want to get loans or whatever, you're just, the structures of society, the institutions are going to be much more effective in a high trust situation. So one of the questions for us is, are we fragmenting into a society that is low trust in a different way, in a new and different way? Maybe not entirely new, but where ideologically, regionally, and other kinds of ways. And you see a variety of disturbing evidence on this. I mean, one particular fact that really struck me in some of our research was, in the 1950s, 5% of Americans would have been sad if their child married someone of another political party. 50% of Americans, unfortunately, would have been sad if their child married someone of another race. Those numbers have flipped. So thankfully, a very tiny percentage of Americans now care if their kid marries someone of another race. But almost half of American adults would not like it if their kid married someone of another political party. That's indicative of broader public opinion data that's showing that increasingly political and ideological camps are viewing the other side not as Americans who think something different from us, but as the enemy. Now, that's not a permanent and linear trajectory, and groups like yours are fighting against it, obviously, but in that kind of, where that goes for a country, and there's so many complicating factors, like, for example, a given political party, you can have a strong majority of a given political party that is a very modest percentage of the overall population, and yet, because the party is dominated by that 23% of the population, the party has a certain character, the nominees have a certain character, and then you get all kinds of implications for that, right? So there's a lot of ways in which this could go forward, and I'll just finish by saying, Seth was talking about alienation, and I think this is a really powerful theme. Another thing I've looked into is sort of the sources of radicalization. And I think we all have a sense in some ways, more or less, some people less so, but kind of as you were saying, that there are trends in our society that are making us or many people feel more alienated, more unhappy with our political leadership, believing that the system is rigged, believing that the system is corrupt, not trusting outcomes to be legit, all kinds of things like that. And one of the sources of mistrust that leads to is, of course, you probably all have seen these polls on the percentage of Americans who have faith in major institutions in society, particularly political institutions. Another fact that I saw the other day was pretty striking. George III, King George of England, was more popular in the United States on the eve of the American Revolution than our government is today among the American people.
Was there a poll taken?
Well, okay, so the scholar speaks up and says there's no polling for that.
To be entirely fair, Mike, we first rebelled against Parliament, not against the king.
Well, fair enough. We hope the king, and only when he. Okay, so understand that, and understand that this is a qualitative estimate based on indirect information. Maybe people that identified themselves as loyalists and things like that. What percentage of the American? I don't know, but it's indicative of the idea that our faith in institutions is very low, under 20%. In some cases, well under 20%. So anyway, there's this process of alienation, and having studied sources of radicalization in other countries, I find it still kind of a mystery of exactly what's going on. Because in the case of populism, for example, as just well knows, there's a big debate between the economic theorists and the cultural theorists. Those who say that it's all about inequality. Populism is a result of people saying, the rich have it all, we have nothing, we're ticked off, we want to take it back from them. The cultural theorists say it's all about the loss of national identity, it's the immigrants, they're coming, they're taking, it's people who are different from us, it's the whole, all of the sort of race, ethnicity, culture aspect of it that gets people worried, paranoid, afraid, and leads to, now it could be both at the same time, they're not mutually exclusive, but there's a lot of other factors going on too. And there's such a complex of mosaic of issues that you have to pull apart to try to get a diagnosis of what's going on in the society, that it makes it really hard to come up with a simple agenda where you can just say, this is the problem the country's facing, this is the solution, therefore we can all agree going forward. And that exacerbates the challenge of overcoming the polarized divide, I think.
Yeah, so I'll just add 2 points from what Michael said. First, hearing the data on the marriage, which I've heard before, I just wonder if Braver Angels should repackage themselves as a cross-political dating association, something like that. Maybe that would help the next generation resolve two-party families.
It would solve all of our financial questions, actually.
Well,
I think you just came up with a great business plan.
we talk about bridging institutions, that would be bridging the left and the right. So, but more seriously, when we talk about social trust, one of the things you also find if you dig into the data is social trust in America is very group and place-based. You can imagine that whites have higher social trust than blacks, but you also can imagine rich people have higher social trust than poor people. But I would say if you dig a little deeper, you'll find out that a lot of it's place-based. People who are in flourishing neighborhoods are much more likely to be trusting than people who are in distressed or isolating neighborhoods. And I even have a piece that will come out in a few months on how do you operate in a low trust neighborhood, because it's something that very few organizations or policymakers think about. They just assume away the problem of trust, and they don't actually consider how what they do might increase distrust, or how they might adapt how they work to increase trust of their work or increase trust in the neighborhood as a whole. I have an organization in Detroit that found out in a pretty bad way how important trust was, so they designed trust into everything that they do. So I do think, even when we say high trust, low trust, it's very place or group specific in the United States.
Let's go a little bit closer to the realm of security studies for security studies' sake here too. One of the most common things I will hear a lot is the idea that groups form themselves on the basis of common enemies, which is true in various degrees, I think. And then I also often hear, well, the reason why American society is so divided against itself and there's no real common American purpose and national identity at this moment is that it's been 80 years since our last major war, or 70 years since our last major war. And we don't have the Nazis or the communists putting us all together right now. I personally have been quite skeptical of this notion because in a lot of American history, we tend to go at each other's throats in wartime as much as we come together. But I'm wondering if you two have thoughts on the impact of shared national trauma as something that does create national mission and build social trust in a sense from the outside in and from the top down. Does the existence of common enemies, if we were suddenly to go warmongering against the Chinese and the Russians or something like that, would that be something that has any real impact helping American society? Would that be something that would drive us further apart? What are your thoughts on this?
I guess I would say, I think, so one hypothesis I would offer in response, and of course there's a bunch of literature on this, and the in-group, out-group phenomenon is deeply studied in political science, and there's no question that there is a fundamental human kind of evolved sensibility that is, us versus them. There's no question about that. But specifically whether an enemy creates consensus, it certainly can happen. But I would say that in the cases I'm familiar with, the effect it has is discrete and specific in certain ways. So for example, currently the, I think, somewhat exaggerated China threat is absolutely causing some people of both political parties to work more closely together on some issues, okay? But that doesn't mean that Americans as a whole are rallying to American identity in different ways. So to me, it's kind of, it can have that effect, but it's a very dangerous phenomenon to play with, and I wouldn't count on it for solving the problem.
So I would say, there's some, I can agree with the argument to some extent. Just look at Ukraine. Ukraine had many divisions that have incredibly disappeared because of the war. It doesn't mean they're not worried about their social cohesion. One of the projects I have is an assignment that comes from their government to look at challenges to their social cohesion now and after the war, because it's clearly on their mind that the war is creating potential cleavages, potential divisions that could have repercussions if the war goes on a long time and in the peace. But just look at what has happened, how much their society is unified. Look at the United States after 9/11. We had a couple of years where there was incredible willingness to sacrifice, step up. I mean, for this to continue, the threat has to go on for a long time. The leadership, the institutions and leadership have to act in ways that sustain it. So it's not like you have something and it works as a force by itself. You have to have the external force, and then you have to have internal action, both leadership, but I would say also the nature of how institutions operate that will reinforce the dynamic. I think like many of the questions that we're addressing, these problems are not one-dimensional, they're multi-dimensional, but to the extent that an external force helps unify people, if that external force continues for many years, creates a high level of anxiety or some sort of existential worry, and has the right leadership and the right behavior of not only the top leadership, but leadership across the country, across many institutions and political viewpoints, if they're all stepping up, they're all making sacrifices, they're all showing that this is their country and they're making an effort to support the country, that behavior combined with the external force, I think that can be a very virtuous cycle to build strong national identity and help the country make a lot of progress, make decisions that are very hard to make in normal times. But both, I think, are necessary, and it depends upon the time period as well.
Can I just add something to what I said? Because it raised a really important issue, which is this idea of the leaders being seen to respond. And another theme that came out of the first phase in our study was the idea of a public-spirited elite as opposed to a self-interested elite. And we're actually doing a follow-on piece on that, trying to define what do you mean by a public-spirited elite. But a classic example is in the post-war United States. Look, it wasn't perfect. The business community was profit-oriented as they are now, but you had a significant number of business leaders who believed that maintaining social cohesion was in their interest, because without it, they wouldn't have a basis to do business in. And you had a number of business organizations that got involved in various aspects of promoting certain kinds of public policies. You had certain business leaders that spoke out in favor of unionization and other trends so it was just one example, and then taxation policies, all kinds of things, where whatever the challenge is, domestic or international, if the people feel like elites, establishment, political leaders, there's a lot of ways we could define this. But if the people in charge are kind of on our side, if they're sacrificing with us, if they are public-spirited and working on behalf of the common good, that is a critically important factor in creating the kind of positive dynamic I think you're talking about.
I'll just add one more thing. This idea of elites and their relationship with the rest of society, it's a very important issue that's not discussed often. I have a piece, actually, American Purpose's predecessor, The American Interest. I have
Rest
a piece
in
on.
peace. What a wonderful magazine.
It's a good magazine. We like to think American Purpose is equally good. We did like American Interest. And it talks about elite behavior, and it looks at what people like Toynbee and Durkheim, and going all the way back to medieval scholars talked about the role of elites in society. It's something that we don't like to talk about today, but if you go through people for hundreds of years, it was a popular topic, and I basically analyzed, compared what all these scholars have said about elite behavior, and then I looked at American elites, and I basically thought that one of our problems in our society is that our elites are missing in action, they're self-interested, they are to a too great extent disconnected from the rest of society. They live in their gated communities or their gated neighborhoods. We used to live, we did have inequality, but we used to live in neighborhoods. If I may bring us back to neighborhoods, neighborhoods used to be diverse, not in terms of race, always a problem, but they were diverse in terms of politics, and they were diverse in terms of class. So our society was filled with associational life, what de Tocqueville and others have spoke about, but that associational life was very local, it was very cross-class, it was very volunteer-oriented, it brought people together to solve problems, but elites, they knew, even if they had the bigger house and they lived on the other side of the rail tracks, they were walking distance from each other. They had a vested interest in what was going on locally, and today, I feel most of our elites, they may say one thing and they may want us to all feel good, but they don't have the same interests as most people. They have not indicated they're willing to make the sacrifices necessary for our country. And so this problem of elites in society, for me, goes back to the problem of neighborhoods, and it's a very important issue. Please.
And just quickly to respond to that, because great.
You're not going to talk again.
Yeah.
I like this. This is great.
But a great point, and the point about associations, obviously,
Yes,
as you know,
yes.
there's a really rich literature on this, right? And one of the trends, this is another one of the many things that goes on in society in the post-war era, is you have a time when, as Seth was saying, you join, and even the predecessors to the Rotary Club and whatnot, and those groups would do a lot of local activism and all kinds of things. Gradually, what you have is the professionalization of associational life.
Right.
So it becomes the association for blank, and then they hire professional lobbyists whose job is to get money from
They
you.
become advocacy.
They become advocacy organizations trying to get
Yes.
your money,
Yes.
not membership organizations where you go and where the president of the local paper mill is also a member and you meet that, whatever. So that binding factor that gets to your neighborhood issue and all of
Yes.
that is one of the things that has been, now how can you recreate that? It's with a 21 and a 25-year-old, the idea of getting them to wear the Rotary Club hats and stuff, I don't know if that's going to work. But it is a trend that has sort of thinned out all of the factors of social cohesion you're talking about.
Yes.
There's a lot to mull on this, and we're going to go to audience Q&A in just about 5 or 10 minutes. So everybody, if you can start thinking of your
Get your questions ready.
We'll be getting to that soon. But the fact that we kind of organically got to the question of elites is a wonderful way to end the first part of this conversation. So I will just have one last question for both of you on this here. Mike, one of your previous books, a very well-received book, was on the personal foibles and intellectual blinders of a certain administration's foreign policy elites, making a couple particular decisions that may have been ill-advised or may not have been about a particular country earlier on in this century.
It was about the Bush administration in Iraq. I don't know. It's not like it's secret. The book is published.
And in this, among other things, I believe this was the book where you talk about details on the different ethics of responsibility, the logic of consequences and the logic of appropriateness, I think. And you talk a lot in that book, not just about the knowledge flows to elites, but the way various leaders, when they are in positions of power, when they are in positions of public responsibility for national security, get to have to view themselves differently than they previously had been. And when they fail to view themselves with the logics that are important for their station, they go take their whole country into things that their country takes decades to go into. And so in a room that is full of at least, I believe, a few aspirant elites, and with an audience that probably includes many more, I'm wondering to what degree you think the party elites and the media elites and other folks who operate primarily in domestic politics in America today suffer from the same things and the same issues that you articulated very well in the Bush administration's foreign policy team. And I'm wondering to what degree you think there's a lesson about leadership in general for social trust to be drawn from the failures of the Bush era.
Sure. I mean, to be clear, so this book's called Leap of Faith. It's about the decision to go to war in Iraq and sort of just a kind of study of decision making, how the decision was made and how to explain it. And maybe the central argument was that a lot of the kind of conspiratorial theories that try to explain this are wrong. That more than anything else, just like the Bay of Pigs or Vietnam or a variety of other American tragedies, they're human beings. Now, there are certain particular individuals, Donald Rumsfeld included, who I describe as being more kind of obviously negligent in certain ways. But, George W. Bush, Colin Powell, Condi Rice, a variety of others, they're not malign individuals. They made a terrible misjudgment in this case, and in some other cases, and each of them has their flaws, right? But the point is, they thought they were doing what was in the best interest of the country, and that's one of the dynamics we all see today. Is this intensifying debate about, and it gets to the issues of trust, right? When people are doing something that you find suspicious, do you say, let me understand where they're coming from, and not necessarily to agree with them, or even to think that they're operating appropriately, but at least to say, well, this is what they think they're doing? Or do you say, they are part of a malign conspiracy that's coming to get me? And of course, there's more and more of that going around today. So I think, I am certainly not one who would generalize about elites, except to say that the vast majority of them are, reasonably intelligent people who think that their ideas are the things the nation needs. And so then the issue becomes, in a way, sort of gets back to fundamental political issues, which is something we haven't stressed as much in this conversation, but how are those disagreements then discussed and resolved? And in a lot of ways, democracies are information processing mechanisms at their core. And our information processing mechanism is in the process of being ruined. And so looking forward to how elite debates, how the potential risks and costs of different courses of action, issues of mutual trust will all play out in an environment so heavily governed by misinformation, disinformation, mistrust, in ways that we've only begun to see because of some of the emerging effects of some of the new technologies. That's really my bigger worry. I don't know that elites today are, I agree totally with Seth that in terms of the public-spirited piece, we could be doing a lot better. But in terms of their essential intelligence, motivation, whatever, I'm not sure they're any better or worse than at most times in history. What may be changing is the information environment in which they are operating. And we don't really know where that's going.
Well, I think that will be a fascinating topic for a future forum, and I'll be excited for that. Seth,
if I may just say, so I think one of the arguments I would make is if elites are more disconnected from the rest of society, partly because of where they live, and partly because they have completely different lifestyles, partly because they travel to different places, partly because they don't interact with other people. And not only is that all different, but they also have significantly different interests. They can be making decisions that are either for a lack of information because they're so disconnected, or because their interests are so different. They can be making decisions over and over again that are not in the best interest of most people. And I would say one of the problems which is leading us to I think there's many causes. Clearly, I think the thinning of relationships at a local level in terms of we just don't spend enough time with each other in institutions, in relationships, with our neighbors, in our family, on so many levels. That goes back to this, the making our neighborhoods fragile. Clearly, I think that's a really important issue. But part of that is these elites, if they're disconnected and they have different interests, and they therefore are making decisions differently than they would have made if they were down the block, if they had some similar or roughly similar interests to my own. I think that if that repeats over and over again, then clearly there's much more alienation of the general population or parts of the population with those elites. Those elites are not suffering, are not feeling the consequences of the choices they make. And for me, if that happens, and so, I mean, the Iraq War, I mean, I can never connect one to the other, but you could certainly see issues on trade. Trade would be a very simple issue. I believe in free trade, but I've been to lots of parts of this country where the country might have benefited, but large numbers of people did not benefit. So how do you balance the national needs versus the place-based needs? And if elites were more tied to those places, possibly they would have made, again, Michael used the word balance, so clearly there's a balance between these different interests, but to the extent that elites are so far removed and the elites have such different interests, I do believe it leads to worse decision-making, that leads to more unhappiness and more alienation. That would be part of my argument, and therefore we should all live in cross-class neighborhoods. It's very important.
This would be some fascinating legislation to make.
That's very hard. I believe in the free market, but that's, again, that's a hard one.
Let's go to audience Q&A. We have about 45 minutes for this. Let us go first to ma'am in the blue teal. When we're asking, okay, real quick, I gotta do this every time. When you're asking a question, please stand, please tell us who you are, and please make sure that your question takes the form of a question. And I promise you that every question every statement can be turned into a question by simply adding at the end, and what does the speaker think about that? So, ma'am, in the blue dress, tell us where you're from.
Mary Gottschall from Falls Church, Virginia. Wanted to ask you, what do you think about the demographic tsunami, the aging of the baby boom, the silver tsunami, and that the younger generation is more multicultural and diverse than any generation in American history? So how is that going to affect the social fragmentation? And then the other issue I wanted to ask you about is the decline of organized religion. Gallup came out with a poll showing 31% of Americans do not think that going to any organized, they're not part of any organized religion. They say they're spiritual but not religious. We read a lot about churches being repurposed into housing, and one was made into a brew pub in Pittsburgh, and that I read about lately. And then finally the internet and the fact that a lot of young people would socialize with groups, maybe playing games or something. You know, they could be in Japan, they could have these friends around the world they're playing games with, instead of say going to the local Y and playing games. So those would be the three issues I wanted to address.
Yeah, I'll be happy to start. I think that for sure, I'm a big believer in immigration. I'm a big believer in religious liberty, including the right not to believe in a religion. I'm a big believer in technology. But I think that, again, when you think about this thing of balance, a society to maintain its social cohesion needs to, and the United States has a great absorptive capacity for immigration, but we don't have infinite absorptive capacity. So I would argue, in terms of your 3 points, everything is about a balance. Yes to greater diversity, but we need to always be clear that they need to be absorbed into the American society and culture in a way that promotes social cohesion. And there are some limits. If we doubled the population tomorrow, and clearly that would be hard for us to absorb all those people. So again, I would say yes. In terms of religion, again, people can do whatever they want, but there's clear data that people who belong to a church or a mosque or a synagogue or a Hindu temple or whatnot, they're more likely to be generous, they're more likely to volunteer. So again, there are downsides to the country becoming less and less religious, And so again, at an individual level, you can understand that. On a society level, you have to worry, what are the consequences simply for trust? And I would say the decline of religion is very parallel to the anti-institutional mentality of Americans in general. I think it affects so many things. People don't want to get married. People don't want to belong to a religious institution. People don't want to be bothered with local organizations. So all of this is happening in parallel, actually. So, and it all has negative implications. And in terms of technology, again, I think people who their best friend is their phone. I mean, that may be that some people that you can understand why there's loads of benefits. You can see how many hours a day I'm on my phone, but to the extent that we don't have embodied existence, that we're not in relationships, that we're not involved with certain institutions, there's clearly on the society level, again, individual, you can always see good things. On the society level, you're likely to get more mistrust, more alienation, and people will have less and less capacity to even form relationships and to compromise and to work with others. And so in general, the stronger, the more flourishing our neighborhoods are, the more resilient we will be on all three of your levels. If our neighborhoods are able to absorb a certain amount of diversity, and our neighborhoods are able to have a rich social life, we have a rich social life in Chevy Chase, a lot of that, I mean, they're wealthy, but you can have a rich social life in a poor neighborhood. It doesn't have to be religious. Religion is part of it. And if we are all in close relationships locally, the technology, we will be more resilient with flourishing neighborhoods to all three of the challenges you mentioned.
I just want to say, anecdotally speaking, as a member of the younger generation who is addicted to my phone and who does routinely post memes and copy pastas in Facebook groups and unhinged group chats that will eventually come back to me and get me in trouble, I have personally, and there's a lot of people in here who have personally created immense amounts of social capital in social media too. And I think something that that would be fascinating to discuss at a greater length, and maybe this is something for the Pentagon to be looking at as well, is to what degree are online networks not just things that you associate with ISIS and like right-wing radical terrorists and Antifa groups and whatever, but also things that create a really different non-space-based kind of community that can never be quite the same as space-based communities, but is a sort of social capital that can build something else too. And I'd be fascinated to see.
There's been a lot of research on that already.
Oh, already?
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
Good. What's some of the thoughts been so far?
Well, I mean, I'm not able to sort of summarize it all, but your basic point that people trying to figure out what kind of social capital is this, how does it compare to more traditional types, is it a sustainable model?
Mm-hmm.
In answer to the question, one thing I would say just on one of them is the demography piece, and as you probably know, the United States is actually in a better position in terms of aging and declining population than a lot of countries. China, their population has already started to actually decline, and they're about 1.4 billion. The estimate is that by 2100, they're going to have a population of 700 to 900 million. That's how quickly and how much they're going to decline. A lot of European countries are going to start to decline. Japan obviously has been aging for a while. And to me, the most interesting implication is economic. So it is both because of, economic growth and productivity often comes from kind of size of productive workforce, and plus which the costs of people like me getting older and, my kids think they got it good now.
We're
Wait till
getting
they
younger,
have to,
aren't we?
No. I wish. But anyway, the cost of supporting, when you get to a situation where it's 2 active workers for 1 retiree, has a significant effect on economic growth. And of course, there's all kinds of projections of this. And along with other factors, it raises this question of really, in a lot of ways, since, the Industrial Revolution is, the economic kind of process is sometimes talked about as the hockey stick era, where economic productivity growth and economic growth for history is kind of going along a little bit, and then all of a sudden the Industrial Revolution comes and it goes like this. Well, it's turning over the top of that, right? And governmental legitimacy, social stability has to somewhat of an extent, one factor, been a product of the perception of continued progress, We're all on a train that's moving in a good direction. We're gonna get, our kids are gonna be wealthier than us. Intergenerational mobility, income mobility is down significantly. So what happens when that fundamentally changes? And when new generations are coming along thinking, I'm probably gonna be economically worse off than my predecessors. And it's inevitably built into the structure of society. How can we make that okay without exacerbating all the other factors that we're talking about?
Further questions? This gentleman in the blue on the
Sure.
side.
Two questions. One, pack them together. Like, I heard lots and lots of your observations and metrics, things like basically anchored to how does the subject feel? Are they feeling included? Are they feeling hostile? Are they feeling popularized? Things like that. And this is characteristic of sort of the larger bridging community too. Very much is affective. I was waiting to hear more focus on the information shifting going on, and particularly the information explosion, which is absolutely unprecedented in human history. The rapidity of new data, new things like that. And one posed the question, is the problem really, how does the subject know? Like, at the fundamental trust thing, all of us are not even on our hind heels anymore, trying to keep up with some sort of clue to the source of, like, how do I know where a truth is, let alone a misinformation or a good piece. So if you would speak to that, but it seems like the entirety of if you go upstream, the entirety of polarization is a deconfliction issue. It's like we have no curation issue.
Thank you for this question. I was hoping somebody would bring it up. Mike?
Well, I'll just say quickly, I think you're exactly right. So there's been a lot of stuff written on, we had a big project on truth decay. There's been a lot of stuff written on sort of a post-truth era and that sort of thing for the reasons you're saying. I don't know if many of you have this sense, but I sort of feel like it's the Twitterization of everything. It's like whatever you read today, you're gonna forget tomorrow because there's gonna be an avalanche of new stuff, so.
I'm in AI, and it's gonna be worse tomorrow.
Yeah, well, exactly, right. And, I'm old enough to remember times when an article would come out and people would be talking about it for 6 months, and now you just don't see that. So anyway, losing a grip on a sense of, in some of my work, I've started to really emphasize this idea of ontological security, which is a sense of sort of solidity of your feeling of being in the world. I think that is more of a security issue going forward than the security of our borders from invasions. So it sort of relates to that. One other factor I'll just mention quickly, I've just become more and more convinced of a theme I wrote in an essay like 20 years ago, which I called the pessimism syndrome. And the idea is a lot of the media sources we encounter have an incentive to give us bad news. We know that, right? Bad news sells, they sort of say it, but it is verifiable in measurable ways. Okay, studies have been done. You can also empirically prove that people believe that a lot of economic and social realities, such as the unemployment rate, the economic growth rate, crime rate, they think they are worse than they actually are because of that. So to your point about how, it's about affect and people's perception of reality. If that perception is consistently driven, and then you add on to that social media and people being caught up in, all sorts of narratives about how we're headed toward disaster, you get people who are uncertain about their information, but being pulled in a direction where they are even more pessimistic than they should be, which is dangerous.
I mean, I'll just say, in general, when a question like this comes up, I often think the best way is look at the United States, how it's being impacted, and look at comparable countries. And if the United States is a real outlier in terms of its ability to withstand, and I think in terms of our how we've been affected by social media in terms of our politics, we end up, I would say, quite worse than many of our comparative developed countries. You have to ask what is underlying in the society that's making us more vulnerable. I mean, our deaths of despair, our drug deaths are off the scale compared to everywhere else, maybe except for Scotland. Would be the only place, and that's only a few million people. So if our reaction to social media and other changes in the information environment is worse, and I do think it's worse, if there's something in the society that's dividing us, leading us to be not trustful of our leaders and our institutions, and you have to dig deeper and deeper and find that problem, and then you have to think about how could we address that problem. That's generally how I would think about these challenges.
Ontological security also sounds like a fascinating way to take a bunch of philosophy majors and make them special forces.
I'll take that idea back to the Pentagon. I'm sure that Special Forces leadership will be anxious to get the philosophers on board.
Let's go to this gentleman in the very back. Sir.
Thank you. Alan Carby, Washington, D.C.
Can you speak up, sir? Can you speak up?
Alan Carby, Washington, D.C. I generally identify as red. That's fine. Okay. Within the context of your analyses, how did we succeed in Korea when we failed in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan? Does that?
In the war, you mean? Basically, why did we succeed?
The country was divided. All of those wars, Korea. I mean, we went through national and Vietnam, but why did we succeed in Korea?
I'd say, for one thing, it was a conventional war. It wasn't a guerrilla war, so that's a huge part of it. Whereas Vietnam is just a very different kind of enemy and different kind of conflict. You had, as a result, you had more of an imminent risk, I think, of nuclear escalation. At one point, you had MacArthur arguing for using nuclear weapons on the border of China. The Chinese perceived that. You had rivalries between the Soviets and Chinese that created opportunities. So there were a lot of specific things. And then the balance militarily between the two Koreas kind of led to, then you could say, well, we didn't really succeed. We prevented failure. All we did was essentially get back to the starting point after
The 1984 Olympics in South Korea.
Well, okay, so if you want to talk about
88.
development, if you want to talk about national development, then it is a story of how the South Koreans succeed, right? And it's obviously there's a huge literature on Asian tigers and the economic growth strategies, the nature of those societies and cultures. Some of the factors we were talking about earlier, as you see in China today, there was a sense that, we are going to prove to the world what Koreans can do. We have a national agenda and drive to make ourselves an economic juggernaut. We're going to sacrifice for that. It generates a willingness of people to sacrifice for the goal. So there's a lot of factors involved, but it's a good question about that. What role did America play? And I'll just finish by saying a critical distinction, and I think a factor that relates to some of the areas that Seth has looked at is America trying to help promote, protect, and sponsor a partner that has the inherent political and social wherewithal to bring themselves to the next level if we can just do some things around the edges? Or are we dealing, as in the case of Afghanistan, with a government that we spent 20 years trying to reform and we just couldn't make it work properly, and so it collapsed very quickly when we left, the military institutions and the political institutions. So I think that is one of the enormous lessons we've learned in foreign policy over the last 30 to 70 years, is if you are dealing with a partner that has inherent social and political problems that mean that it's just not going to reliably pick up its share of the burden, you can stay for a long time and you're not going to get success.
That's what we thought about Korea, by the way.
Let's move on. Let's move on from this just a little bit. This is a fascinating question with big implications for, I think, America domestically as well too. But let's keep moving. Just a little forward. Ma'am in the front here.
Yes, thank you. My name is Lindsay Coates, and I live in the District of Columbia. Thank you to Braver Angels and for American Purpose for doing this, and to our speakers. Very grateful. So I have a question about the role of women in society, because I keep thinking about this through a gender lens. So if you look, for example, if you look at China, some of their problems with aging is the fact that the one-child policy led to a gender imbalance. When you think about American society, a lot of the stresses that we are living through right now rest on the fact that family life is very stressed by the unpaid labor of women to care for children, to care for elders, and you also have workplace policies that don't support women. And then you look at things like studies of corporate boards where they have better outcomes if they have gender balance, or you look at female leaders and you have more stability. So I feel there's a missing through line in this discussion that I'd love for you all to address about the social role of women and the economic role of women and how that plays into social trust and social cohesion.
I think it's missing because when we talk about social cohesion issues, we don't typically think about them with a gender as like a different dimension. But clearly, if you look at cross-country studies, and I mean this is global, countries in which women have significant role, like in politics and other aspects of society, and in which violence against women, as well as children, is less, tend to be more peaceful. So clearly there is, in terms of my field, in terms of the peacemaking field, I mean, you can easily bring in gender as an important issue. I think where it relates to the United States, again, I'm thinking flourishing neighborhoods. When I think about raising a family, when people talk about our decline in our birth rate, and they talk about the decline in marriage, we tend to get fixated on what is the policy question. And I tend to be very skeptical that it's a policy question. And there's all these debates that we need to, surely more money for families with kids would be very helpful and so on and so forth. But I tend to think if you live in a flourishing neighborhood with your supportive institutions and ways for families to have an easier time with their kids, and I'm thinking relational. There is a material aspect. I cannot say that having, I would like more money for my family, of course. So I mean, we all can think of it that way. But the way I would look at it is, if a society allows each person to flourish in their relationships and in their institutions, men and women, especially where you live and in your neighborhood and in the places around your neighborhood, I think that in itself will be very beneficial and will address some of the issues that you've raised.
A lot of American civil society in the times that Seth has discussed as being some of the halcyon days of it as well, were actually run very directly by women. I mean, there's a conference going on right now. It's the national meeting of the Daughters of the American Revolution. You all might have seen them walking around on the streets there with their flowers and their ribbons. And a lot of, probably about 2/3 or 3/4 of what Tocqueville argued was good about America was basically run by women, which is an interesting and understudied piece of history in a lot of these as well too. Mike, do you have any add?
You know, I would say, just from the standpoint of what we looked at in our study, it sort of gets to this idea that points to the shared opportunity piece. And I think, you know, there's so many aspects of that question of which I'm ignorant. The one piece of sort of historical evidence that we looked at was, as you were sort of implying, in terms of the critical role of expanding gender equality in meeting this goal of shared opportunity for more rather than less competitive nations. And I think, you know, if there's any lesson we have, is that that's only going to become more important when we have the aging phenomenon going on. You're just not going to be able to afford. And as you sort of, your question implied, there's a lot of countries in the world where even though there's some technical legal equality, a lot of actual measures of workplace equality and things like that are, you know, nowhere near where they are in Europe or to some extent the United States. So I think just that idea of it is an integral piece of what the most competitive societies have to pursue in order to maximize their dynamism and energy, and there's a lot of empirical evidence to support that.
Let's go to a couple more questions. Let's go first to Dale. Dale?
Which I just want to comment on hers and then ask my question, which is that a lot of the
Just
work...
make sure to ask it as a question.
My name's Dale Brown. I am one of the co-chairs of Washington DC Alliance, working on the one-on-one committee. So I know that's what you're supposed to do. My comment is, much of the work of building society and communities has been done by women, unpaid, and as women entered the workforce, there's been less of it. But my question is a request for advice for those of us who are doing organization building. Specifically, Braver Angels is having a huge conference, and many of us are involved in organizations. What advice do you have directly to organizational leaders on how to develop organizations that not only create the tasks, not only do the tasks, but build the kind of relationship and community that you're talking about.
I mean, I'll say a few things. So hopefully, hopefully you're going to be in Gettysburg. So
No.
I'll be in Gettysburg for
Oh,
one day. So hopefully some of you will go. It's a conference that they're having next week. But I'll say that what's a good organization, and I mean this is what I write about, is I think what's most missing in our society are place-based organizations that can bring people together to help address challenges in their place. I mean, neighborhoods. Our society used to be very, very rich in place-based organizations. So if you're, in terms of you're asking the practical thing, I would say focus on, I mean, make sure you have clear goals. I don't know if this is the type of things you're looking at. Make sure that there's inclusive leadership and some sort of formal process. I mean, I always think about not only the short term, but the long term in terms of wanting to sustain your organization. How do you institutionalize, if you understand me by institutionalize? I mean, what you always want to do is convert energy and an enthusiasm to help in the short term into some sort of institution that can be self-sustaining in the sense that it brings people together, that it has some sort of organization, that has some sort of sustainable leadership, and might be rotating, but it has to be sustainable, that it has a sustainable funding model. I mean, all these things, I could go on and on. If you had more questions, I'm sure I could give you more afterwards, but I would say, think of it as an institution and build it as an institution, and don't just build it as volunteer stuff is great, but volunteer stuff that's converted into something that's institutionalized and self-sustaining financially, operationally, governance, and everything else is extremely important to maintain it over time.
And if you do that, you might just accidentally contribute to enhancing American national security. There's a question in the back here. Yes, introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Moy, and I work in higher education, actually the 5th largest university in the nation, which is Florida International University. And I would like to know what are your thoughts on the correlation between social trust and today's education system? Also, to what extent political polarization has influence on our generation's learning process when they are easily and extremely exposed to news and media on a daily basis?
Thank you for this.
Did you come from Florida? Did you just say you're from in Florida?
I'm from Florida. I moved here like 2 months ago. I work for the office here for a government.
I got it. I didn't think we were in Florida for some reason.
Not yet, it's coming north.
Coming north. I hope that's not a political statement. Please go ahead. You want to answer that, or should I? I'm happy to say something.
Go ahead and start.
Okay, so I would just say that I think it's somewhat separated or divorced from this conversation, but I do think to the extent that universities are extremely important. I mean, they're training our future leaders. They're training in terms of our top universities. They're training our future elites, to circle back to the previous conversation. To the extent that universities, especially top universities, are training people who do not think that they have responsibility and obligation and loyalty to the country, they're actually doing a disservice to the country, in my opinion. I mean, the people who graduate, we like to think they're going to graduate into jobs and into careers where they're going to give back to the country that they grew up in, and I'm not always sure that's the case. I mean, it's not really intentional, but I do think when you look at the problems of elites, part of it is the way they've been trained to think. I have an MBA. I went to a great MBA school, and I certainly think I learned a lot. This is like in a previous lifetime, because I don't do that stuff anymore. But the point was, I can recall very well how much we were trained to just think about the numbers. I think about the spreadsheets and the income statements, and we were trained to make money. That's what we were trained to do. We weren't trained to be responsible citizens. That was never part of our curriculum. So what does that mean if we train leaders and we train them to think of everything as an income statement? So I would think of it like that, and of course I can't avoid touching upon the fact that universities will be best serving the country when they bring in people from all backgrounds. This is all politics, all classes, all races, and can act as a way to, I mean, they're potentially one of the great institutions that should be bridging our gaps, and I think partly because of the way they operate. And again, I don't think anyone has a bad, they're not doing it intentionally, it's sort of some sort of path dependent, some sort of historical process, but I think they're contributing to the problem when they should be one of the main entry points for improving the problems in our country, to be very honest. That would be my very modest opinion on the subject.
Mike?
I would say just two things. One is sort of picking up on what Seth said. I agree that, like, you know, on the one hand, and this gets back to sort of the issue of balance and how do you get both unified identity along with diversity and pluralism. The universities as a place to just an a la carte menu to go and do a major but kind of study a lot of stuff you want and very sort of transactional, as opposed to a place that is designed to educate good citizens. Now, imagine getting a randomly selected 50 Americans together to say, define what good citizenship is and develop the curriculum and how to, and today when there's obviously so much vicious conflict over what, you know, anything that is perceived to be kind of normative teaching in schools. So that, on the one hand, I think that's true. I don't know if it's possible. The other piece of this, I think, is something we haven't talked about as much, but is another kind of meta trend on top of all this stuff. And some of where you started at the beginning, Seth, actually gets to it when you were talking about sort of technocratic solutions to problems. So most of us take it for granted because it's been true long before we were alive, but we live in the Enlightenment age when we were part of a process of progress based on scientific method that was going to continually find better answers to all of our problems, give us better technologies and so on. And we had societies that built up all kinds of institutions around that, industrial era institutions. I think we're sort of arriving at the culminating point of, not that progress won't continue, not that we're not going to have growth, anything, but the idea that we can have definitive answers to our social problems from more technocratic, scientific-based solutions. And that what we need is big organizations that churn out masses of people who go to the same kind of programs and do the same kind of study and all that sort of stuff. So in other words, 100 years from now, are we going to be sending all of our 18-year-olds off to 4 years of a very similar looking education, after which they will look for a job or not look for a job? I don't think so. So this is a model that is just, I think, at the beginning stages of very serious disruption. And it can be disrupted in good ways and bad ways, and the experimentation that goes on to say, what happens after high school? How do we want to create mechanisms of learning, teaching, apprenticeship, everything else in new ways, I think is going to be potentially one of the more exciting sets of experiments over the next several decades. But at the moment, where I sympathize with what Seth was saying, we have some very big, very, let's face it, money-oriented institutions that are doing their best to lock in the current model and discredit anything that is not that model. And so that tension, I think, you know, in terms of trust and the future of all these issues we're talking about, I think it's going to be a really interesting thing to watch.
Mike, I gotta say, that has to be probably the most soberly optimistic take on the end of the Enlightenment I've ever heard. Actually, it makes me hopeful too. Let's go to the question from Matt, speaking of the end of the Enlightenment.
My name is Matthew Lee, and I'm from South Carolina. And I actually appreciate all of the questions that have been here today. They're all wonderful. And I think they add up to, if Joe Biden today had a really great meal, and he just wanted to invite an academic to advise him on increasing social trust in the United States, he invites one of you guys, what would you tell the President of the United States or a great senator? What can someone in that position do to improve conditions right now? Because it's very easy to condemn, you know, leadership or to condemn the average person for not trusting them. But what are people in charge supposed to actually do about increasing social trust when they have authority and all of the baggage it comes with?
Well, I hate to,
You have the answer.
Thank you. I'll pay you afterwards. I owe you a drink. So, but I would say, I mean, I certainly think that politicians should stand up and say, neighborhood is the unit of change. And we should rethink so many aspects of our society. If each of us lives, so if I was Biden, I mean, there are a few government programs in this area, but most importantly, what would happen if all levels of the government were being evaluated on neighborhoods? I mean, right now, everyone is evaluated. The Department of Housing is on number of units. Education is on, I don't know, probably financial flows or what have you, number of students or whatever it is. Everything is evaluated on the level of the individual. Even if you go to a big urban government, there are very few measurements. I mean, you could probably find crime statistics by neighborhood. You can find bits and pieces, but there's actually, government is designed around silos. Government is not designed around place. And that is one of the reasons why we have these problems, that government is not being evaluated. And in small towns it is, of course, because there's one neighborhood. But for the most part, if I was to sit down with President Biden, and of course I would tell him, I'll choose the restaurant. But I would say that why don't we have a national campaign to ensure that everybody, and certainly there's a lot of poor neighborhoods, distressed neighborhoods, where you would not want to live in those neighborhoods. But even if you live in a materially well-off place, you can be isolated, you can be alienated, because there's nothing in those neighborhoods that bring people together. What would happen if we made it a national campaign that we organized life much more around the places that we lived? I think we'd be fighting a lot less nationally. I think we'd probably have many more relationships locally. We'd be less lonely, less unhappy. A lot of things would be very different. So that would be the advice I would give to the president.
The thing that occurs to me is to say, you know, ideally at the beginning of an administration, not at the end, but think about avenues to change in the country that are not through executive branch departments, and they are not through the Congress, they are through networks of other actors in society. I think that is more the future of social change. So if we want to revolutionize higher education, you go out and you find 5 or 6 forward-thinking governors, Republicans and Democrats. You find a few university presidents. You find several CEOs. You find a couple of billionaires, each of them willing to say, I'm going to put $5 billion toward really exciting experiments in this space once we figure out what those experiments are. You put together a coalition of people who almost, and I'm not saying to give up on the Congress or Washington, but that the more exciting stuff is happening at the state level rather than the federal level. And I really see, you know, like a governance revolution, at least plausible, in which in 50 years, it's those kinds of coalitions of actors that are creating social change, even if there's no legislation in Washington. You get a bunch of experimental new higher education designs, you promote them, people see them, and you create catalytic effects. So that would be my advice, is start leading outside Washington and start putting together, and in a way that like brings people together and tries to hold them accountable, you know, and shames people. To get to our point about elites, you know, you walk quietly, right? You walk into a CEO of whatever, some enormous company, and you say, you're gonna do this. Because if you don't, I'm gonna say I offered you the chance and you didn't, and I'm gonna spend the next year making fun of you. We need you to be invested in this society. And this is one way, maybe you find that because they've spoken about it or something, and you get these people together and with force of personality and will, and then with leadership and some money, and you create these catalytic things on 10 or 12 issues. I think that would be my advice.
It's interesting. It seems that there were predecessors to both of your answers here in the Johnson administration in one sense, and in the George W. Bush administration in one sense. and that the fact that those were overshadowed by other things in national security especially seems to have dropped them under the radar and made everybody forget about them for some time. But perhaps those are better legacies from the 60s and the 2000s
Yeah.
to be thinking on.
I have a great quote from LBJ in my book. And I think it's a graduation speech at Howard University, might be 65, don't quote me on the year. And he talks about the idea that basically talent is equally distributed across a society, but that talent depends upon something to do with the social context, something to do with the family, something to do with the neighborhood, and to the extent that we can ensure everyone grows up in a flourishing family and a flourishing neighborhood, everybody will be able to use their talent. And to the extent that we're not able to do that, we basically lose lots of people. And I think we just the same as there was racial issues that he was talking about, but these social issues I think today are they're much larger than we can imagine, unless you go to some parts of this country, in cities, but also in parts of the rural and suburban areas. It's sad to see how many people grow up in this country, and it's the social context is not favorable because of their neighborhoods and their homes.
Let's take one last question. The gentleman here in the front.
Hi, I'm David Ruffin. I live here in Washington. One of the things I was thinking about, I was listening to you talk about balance, and I think we have an enormous imbalance. I think when you look at corporations, organizations like ALEC, when you look at sort of the religious right, and then sort of the right-wing sort of white supremacists, you know, they're very well organized and they have a lot of money. They're backed by major foundations and corporations. When you look on the other side, labor unions are basically gone. I mean, have very, very little influence in the country. And they did 30, 40, 50 years ago. There used to be a welfare rights organization. Welfare women were organized under a guy named George Wiley, who died in a boat accident. But Acorn organized poor people. All those organizations are gone. So there's no counterweight to those very, very powerful organizations. And I'm afraid that a lot of those organizations on the right don't seem to be very patriotic. Corporations, I think, are very much focused on profits, and the religious right is not. I think they're more interested in the Bible than the Constitution, and I'm wondering how we can. I'm wondering how we can deal with that kind of balance when you have those very, very powerful forces.
Thank you, sir. Seth, Mike, you can take it however you like.
You want to go? It's up to you. You want me to take the question?
Go ahead.
First of all, I will say, since I deal with polarization in lots of countries, I always start by looking at each side equally. I think that I've been in lots of discussions, and so I can sympathize with your argument, but I always start with the premise that polarization requires two sides. And whenever there's a problem on one side, there's usually a parallel problem. I think Stephanie, who's here, wrote something of a similar respect not too long ago. Probably a little different than what I'm exactly saying, but the same idea that there's some parallel. So I'll just put that and say, but I would say that the problems of unions, it's interesting. I mean, you very rarely hear the decline of religion, decline of unions, the decline of local associational life. You very rarely hear these topics discussed at the same time. if they've all happened in parallel, which makes me believe there's a greater, I mean, even when you talk about the religious right, there's a very good book by Ross Duteau, a columnist for the New York Times, called Bad Religion. And I could have really good conversations with my Christian friends about what is religion today isn't Christianity. I mean, Christianity in the United States is not what it used to be. And so I don't want to speak anything about particular groups because I'm not so informed about it. But I would say all of these issues about the changing nature of religion, the decline of institutional life, including unions, the change on the left and right in terms of the nature of organizational life, the non-governmental, that they have offices in Washington, they have a lot of professional staff, and they're lobbying for money or policy changes, and they're not out there in the communities, which I think is a problem on the left and the right, with some exceptions. There's a few organizations, I always tell Brave Angels, they need to be in every neighborhood. They're not, they have to be one in Washington, they need to be in 30 neighborhoods in Washington. So I would just say that I would look for the broader forces and question what is it that we can do to counter the broader forces that are misshaping our society in ways that will not lead to good outcomes.
Have I been pronouncing Ross Douthat's name wrong this whole time?
It could be that I'm pronouncing it wrong since I don't use his last name in conversation. Somebody please correct me.
Let me ask you two one last question, and we'll use that as a prelude to final remarks. Consider this, I guess, a prompt for your final remarks to us this evening. My question for each of you two to close us out is, you two are both scholars of national security studies. You two both are constantly asking different questions to think about the different sorts of threats and the different sorts of strategies to approach those threats. And what, for the next year or so, between now and the 2024 election, with everything going on in the world and everything going on in American society, are you thinking, are you wondering about, are you asking about, are you questioning about? What are the modes of understanding security in the broad sense? What are the questions that you're trying to answer for yourselves over the next year? Partly stuff that we discussed here, but also stuff as well, I said.
I mean, well, there's the obvious ones. I mean, how's the war in Ukraine going to end? And you know, how do we get to some sort of cessation of hostilities that does not rule out the reversal of Russian territorial gains, and that keeps it from escalating? I mean, that's, you know, the dangers involved in that situation are probably greater than any other national security issue out there. So that's obviously a leading one. I'm going to be watching how the U.S.-China rivalry plays out. There's a lot of instability in that relationship and in the U.S. dialogue about it. And I think I've thought for a number of months now that we're sliding down, not that China isn't a challenge and even in some ways a threat to the United States and to some others, it clearly is. But I think we're sort of sliding into just rote statements about the China threat, about our response, things like that, that we've not thought through, and potentially commitments to certain courses of action that we don't really know where we're headed. So I'm going to be watching to see how that sort of plays out, particularly under the exacerbating influence of an election season. But then in terms of everything we've talked about, you know, what I'm mostly concerned about is how the societal engine of American competitiveness is being tended in a way, and what's happening in our politics and society. And I think the answer to that, actually, I mean, we can, you know, it sounds like Seth and I are sort of, you know, have similar views on this, that there are obviously some trends going in a bad direction. There are obviously some groups in our society that are taking actions that are worsening polarization. But it really is an enormously complex picture. I mean, again, at the state level, there are tremendous experiments going on the part of, you know, moderate governors in some of the areas we're talking about that don't reflect the same sort of national debate we're talking about. There's elements of American residual strength that continually reassert themselves. There's ways in which responses to crises show a potential for state capacity that we didn't know we had. So I think it's a really complex issue, and we can all watch to see, are we getting the kind of leadership that we increasingly need? Are we seeing signals that certain key things are starting to trend in a better direction? What kind of evidence are we seeing on that? Because more than, despite the fact that I spent a career working on national security issues, mostly on the foreign policy side, the military capability side, things like that, I think our work on this study clearly indicates that history shows that it is the health of that societal engine that is going to determine our fate in these rivalries. And so that's mostly what I'm going to be watching.
Thank you. I like the last statement. It's our societal engine that will determine the trajectory of the country. I really like that. In terms of your question, the one, I of course paying attention to the war in Ukraine and other foreign policy issues, but the one external threat or the one external challenge that I worry about is not a country, it's the Chinese Communist Party. That's the one external, the one threat that can undermine the freedom of people in the United States and can undermine the freedom and dignity of humanity, actually. So it's the one external threat that I pay a significant amount of attention on, even if I'm not doing any work related to it. I just think that's a much greater risk or threat than anything else, even though, of course, what happens in Ukraine is hugely important and will affect what the CCP does. So that's the one external issue that I worry about, and whenever I spend my some time working on it, when I don't have other things to do. But domestically, of course, I'm looking at the social engine or societal engine. I'm looking at our institutions. How are they reacting? I'm looking at, I think the polls that we see sometimes are not very good representations of what actually people are thinking and going to do. But of course, I'm paying attention to what people are thinking to the extent that we can through the data, or sometimes you have to get past the data because the data is not very indicative. We're all worried what's going to happen in the next election. We all worry about how our institutions will hold, how different party campaigns will play out. But I most am interested in are we becoming more aware of our social challenges to the extent that we can address them, which is more of a long-term problem, and to the extent what are the popular opinions in the country that we can understand in terms of how it will shape what will happen in the next year and a half in the United States.
Well, thank you for having me here too. The two things that I'm leaving this with are, number one, it's good to know that people in the Pentagon are just as confused as I am about how a country that is so constantly sapping social trust and is constantly at its own throat manages to muddle along through crisis after crisis after crisis. I'm glad to know that I'm not the only one confused about that. And the other thing is that I did not expect to walk out of this event with a sense of an idea of how Tocquevillian grassroots civic organizations exert sovereignty. But I think you two in the last 15 or 20 minutes or so have actually given me an idea of what that looks like, a politics beyond policy. And I think that's something that I'm gonna have to take back to my colleagues at Braver Angels and mull with them pretty closely sometime soon here too. So thank you two both for having been here with us this evening. Everybody here in the audience watching, there will be cards on the back table with information on Seth's forthcoming book. Please make sure to take a look at those. Please also make sure to bother Mike after we end this if you are interested in taking a look at his report on the RAND Corporation's website. He also has like a dozen others in the last 2 or 3 years. He's a very prolific writer and has a lot of interesting things there. So please feel free to take a look at those. And in the meantime, those of you who I will be seeing in Gettysburg next week for the Braver Angels National Convention, Let's all huddle after this to chat during the 45 minutes that we continue to have this room until it closes down. But meantime, Braver Angels is the nation's largest black grassroots-led, fully red-blue citizens movement to help Americans of every background find value in each other across all our political, social, and cultural divides. We work to hold America together in times of trial by practicing goodwill ourselves and inviting all our fellow Americans to come in too. We do this through a variety of workshops, debates, trainings, and gatherings at every level of society and excluding no one. If you want a humbler, kinder, more charitable, more honest American political culture and are willing to start with yourself, then we of Braver Angels are the place for you. We are always looking for volunteers and partners, and we can promise you with certainty that whatever happens in politics, we'll be doing the same work. From our beloved community to yours, let us all go forth to bind up the nation's wounds and build a house united. See you very soon, and see some of you all in Gettysburg. Mike, Seth,
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank